This is Crested Butte real estate agent Frank Consella with the Crested Butte is Home podcast. And in this episode, we are going to talk about music. And in particular, we spend a lot of time talking about an instrument which was developed and is built right here in the Gunnison Valley. It's called the Dobrato, and it's been featured in a Grammy-winning song, and it's been in the hands of artists like Jimmy Buffett, ZZ Top, Fish, and Jack White's guitarist. Pretty amazing stuff. So welcome Kent Biles from Castle Creek Guitars to the Crested Butte is Home podcast. Today on the Crested Butte is Home podcast, my guest is Kent Biles. And Kent, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from to start off with?
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for having me. Well, I was born in Muncie, Indiana in 1953, and it was a very wholesome, small hometown kind of environment to grow up in. Really enjoyed it. I really showed a keen interest in music at a very young age. My grandfather was a very accomplished musician, very self-taught, but he could pick up and play pretty much any instrument you put in front of him, and I think that carried over into me. So I really enjoyed fishing. We would ski in the winters up in the Michigan area, and ultimately I knew I wanted to be in more of that kind of environment rather than the cornfields of the Midwest. So I started playing instruments at about 7 years old is when I started playing guitar. After I picked that up, I had some other friends who played also. And, of course, this was, the Beatles were just getting going then, and every kid wanted to be in a band and be a Beatle. And so we started some small bands, and these bands we put together would start to perform. In Muncie, there's Ball State University. Actually, at that time, it was Ball State Teachers College. But at the fraternities and sororities, they'd have Friday, Saturday night dance parties. And our band would get booked to play these fraternities and sorority parties. So I guess I started playing out when I was about 13. My mom we'd stuff all my gear into my mom's car and go by to Freddie's house and get his drums, and we'd stuff it all into a car. Then we'd tell her to come back at 9 o'clock and pick us up. And so she was our roadie. And so anyway, I started playing with these bands in high school. I also played in the high school band, played trumpet. Later on, when I decided it was time to look for a school for college, I wanted to explore areas that offered the fishing and the skiing and so forth that I loved. And we took a trip through Gunnison my junior year, came across Western State at that time, and decided that was going to be a good fit. So moved out here in 1971, came to college at Western State.
Gotcha. Well, amazingly, you are the second person I've interviewed from Muncie. Stephanie Ballard.
Right.
She talked about the ball jars, because
yes.
Right, that's why it's Ball.
Robert Ball was one of my best friends.
Oh wow, really cool. And I want to go back to skiing. I mean, I'm always fascinated by how many people came here from places that you wouldn't think of had skiing,
right.
And yet you skied. So your parents were into it? Were you, like, how did
right.
that...
Mainly my father was really into it, and I started when I was about 3 years old skiing up in Michigan. He got me on skis on, I think they were the old cable bindings and lace-up boots and all that. And we would trek up to mid-state Michigan, go up to a couple of the ski areas. Boyne Mountain was already established, but Caberfay, which was really our favorite, I think we were there the first year they opened that, and it was a nice area. And so we'd get up there at least 3 or 4 times a winter to ski. We also had a pretty good slope of a hill at a golf course back in Muncie. So when we'd get enough snow to go ski it, we'd go out there and set up a Galende jump. And of course, you're tied into your skis with the cable binding, so if you crash, you're generally going to hurt something.
Right.
And I did.
That's funny. Well, let's go back to picking Western State or Western Colorado University, was that like at a counselor's office in high school and they had a book of colleges in Colorado, or how did you find it?
Actually, I had a best friend of mine who got it on his radar first, and we ultimately came out here to school together, but he became aware of it and told me about it, and it sounded interesting. So he was a Boy Scout at Philmont, and at the end of the summer, we'd come, and a couple of friends of mine and I would come and pick him up in Philmont and drive back to Indiana. So we just made a trip where we planned it, where we come through Gunnison so we could take a look at Western State. This was our junior year. And that's when I kind of fell in love with the area.
Got it. So what do you end up studying at Western?
So I studied art and biology. At that time, I wanted to get into doing medical renderings, and I had a keen interest in biology. I had kind of a natural ability in fine arts. And, of course, this preceded being able to draw digitally, all the computer era. So everything was hand-drawn at that point. So there was a different kind of art form to producing the renderings.
So you can draw and play instruments. You've got more of an artistic bent than I was getting.
Right. The gene carried from my grandpa, and I'm happy to have it.
Gotcha. Well, let's go back to music. You already mentioned guitar, but what other instruments did you grow up playing?
So, I started on guitar, trumpet in high school band. When I came to Western State, I had already developed a pretty keen interest in jazz, and I started woodshedding the saxophone, trying to get to a point where I could get out and maybe perform with some local players. And that carried on for a number of years. I was still playing guitar and piano, actually, but I really developed a love for the sax, and so I played with a couple of local Western State bands at that point. And then after those dissolved, I started my own Kent Viles quartet. It was pretty much a straight-ahead jazz quartet. Then we played around the area, a little bit around the state, and so forth.
Got it. So you're saying jazz is kind of your main musical influence, or do you like others?
I would say overall it probably is. However, I have such a keen interest in all styles of music. I fairly recently took up pedal steel guitar. I've been playing that for about 4 years now and really enjoy that. So that lends itself more to some classic country music, which I really enjoy as well. Finger styling guitar players, and that's maybe my style on guitar. I had a time frame there where I was doing some film scoring, and so I had my own home studio set up, and I took a course out of England as to basically how to compose music for film, and that was a lot of fun. I had a very nice keyboard workstation that could replicate violins and cellos and bassoons, and so you could do pretty much full orchestration right off of one keyboard. Wow. I could do that right from my studio. So I delved into that for a while. I've learned towards the end that if you're doing film scoring, you're the last guy to get the film before it's ready to be released, because all the edits have to have been completed before it goes to the music portion.
Okay. Because
there's hit points that you have to hit, and so if they edit something, all of a sudden your music doesn't sync, right? And so it's a real scramble to put this together. When the director finally gets you your piece of film that you're going to score to, they're 2 months late on their deadlines. Their budget is completely spent, and they need it yesterday. So that part of it didn't really interest me that much, but I did enjoy the composition portion of it.
Any movies that people would be familiar with that you can?
Probably not. There are a couple of documentaries that were shot for the state of Colorado, but it was really more the coursework I did was where I produced the most music, because they would demand you do certain length commercials and then short clips and then documentaries. And so most of my composing went into the coursework.
That makes sense. Got it. Well, you've worked, did you ever end up doing these medical drawings, or did you end up going straight into music?
No, went right into, what happened was, I guess it was my sophomore or junior year at Western, I started working for a really fine violin maker named Brad Bowman in town here, and he had a business called the Wildwood Flower Music, and he was predominantly a violin builder, but he also sold guitars, and I think he had some vinyl back at that point too. And so I started working for him, and when I got out of school, it was time for him to move on to a different career, and I basically took over the shop. I had been managing it for about a year prior to his parting, and over time I ended up buying Brad out of the Wildwood Flower Music. And at that point, now we're into the 80s. And so the 80s were a very rock and roll kind of time. So when I took over the shop, we really kind of changed the focus into more electric gear, drum kits and PA systems and keyboards and synthesizers, and we really expanded the vinyl part of the business. That's really what got my foot in the door in being in the music business.
Well, that's not here anymore, so what happened in between that and we're here at Castle Creek Guitar Company? So
I had Wildwood Music, and some of our listeners will probably recall this. It was on Tamichi, and let's see, I had that from the mid-'70s until right around the 90s, early 90s. And we just developed that. We were pretty unique. We had a fairly large inventory for a very small area, which made us more of a destination business where people would come from around the state to shop us. So that worked well. Over time, I moved into a different building, bought a building on Main Street. It's where the old Miner Steakhouse is now. But anyway, we had Wildwood Music in there for about 8 years or so. Along the way, there was a real decline nationally in musical instrument sales. And
this is late 80s now?
Yeah, right. Okay. And because there was, the kids were more interested in these new things, these handheld devices and games that they could start playing. And this is the very early days of it.
This is Nintendo time.
Right, exactly. So it took the focus off of kids wanting to learn musical instruments and put it in a handheld device that they could play on their TV or whatever. So the whole industry saw a real decline. I knew I needed to kind of reinvent, and I started off by reinventing into the audio and visual business because it still kept me within the realm of an area that I was interested in, number one. And there was a very emerging market called custom home audio video design and installation. And I was fortunate to be in on the ground level where as Crested Butte developed and these big homes started sprouting up, a lot of these people came from areas like Dallas or Oklahoma City or wherever where they had nice homes and they had audio-visual systems throughout the house that were integrated, maybe even on a computer, getting to that point anyway. So when they built their second homes up here, they wanted to replicate that. And I was the guy, at that time that had the knowledge and the workforce to be able to start fulfilling that need. So I'd say for the next 10 years, we were pretty much it for audio-visual in the Valley. And we did, I'd say, easily the majority of the homes that went in the 90s and up in Crested Butte, where my company was the one that wired them and did the systems.
Awesome. And at that point, it was more like projector systems and stuff was like
Correct.
The top end.
Whole house audio. It really started out as, I'd kind of like to have some speakers in my bedroom rather than just the living room. And so we'd wire houses where you could put speakers out on the deck, speakers in bedrooms. And that, of course, that whole industry really mushroomed. And to the point where people were doing full-on theater rooms,
right.
and controlling their toaster with their, touch panel screens and so forth. So,
right.
It got very detailed, and it grew rapidly, and to the point where control really was more what we were installing more so than just audio and visual. It was like, how can you control all these different facets of your electronic life? And so that got us into some different control systems that we basically were the first to bring to the Valley. In fact, my company was the first to bring the cell tower or cell phone to the Valley, actually.
Oh, really?
So you can blame me for that.
Or praise you, depending on your outlook, I guess.
I guess along the way, too, this was preceded DirecTV, but I developed a small dish satellite system, relatively small dish. It was called VSAT. So what it was a, at that time, all we had was off-air antenna and maybe cable in town, but if you lived outside of town, you couldn't get really any kind of television signal. So I developed a small dish satellite system. It was a 5-foot in diameter dish in a fixed position, and I would use a standard C-band satellite receiver that I could lock into one satellite and provide you with, I think it was 18 channels of, pure digital quality video and audio. So we, along the way, we put a number of those in around the Valley, too.
I like how you called it small, and then you said 5-foot diameter.
Right.
I've seen a few of those still lying around, but a little bigger than the ones these days.
Right.
In the Crested Butte Real Estate Minute, I wanted to talk about the role of a buyer's agent in real estate transactions. A buyer's agent is someone who works with a buyer to find the right property and take them through the entire contract process. Some people prefer to call listing agents directly, thinking that'll get them a better deal, but I'm here to tell you that is probably not the case. The listing agent's main job is to work for the seller, not for the buyer, so you're kind of playing second fiddle if you contact a listing agent directly. So I would highly recommend finding a buyer's agent. I would recommend myself, Frank Consella. My website is crestedbutterealestateagent.com, and you can find my contact information there if you are looking to purchase a property in Gunnison or Crested Butte. Let's get back to the interview. So how did Castle Creek? When did Castle Creek start?
So in the 2008 and 9, the whole industry with the recession, the construction industry, of course, slacked off.
Right.
And I found I couldn't really sustain a full-on company doing audio-visual and control systems. Mm-hmm. So, because we really needed new holes in the ground. We weren't really the type of business that could move forward with, refitting houses and so forth.
Right.
So the company basically dissolved at that point. And it wasn't long after I met who is now a great friend and my business partner, Brian Howe. So we got together, and he's an avid guitarist. And of course, so am I. And he knew my background in the music business. And we kind of brainstormed to come up with this idea that if we came up with a really nice guitar shop, mainly string-oriented, don't get into all the other peripherals other than accessories, but make a very focused guitar shop in Gunnison, and filled it with ample amount of inventory and interesting inventory, we could probably make a go of it, because there really wasn't anybody at that time doing that in the Valley.
Sure.
So over many bottles of wine and discussions, Castle Creek Guitars, at least the conception of it, was born. And we decided to go through with it, located a space, and here we are.
Here we are. Who's your typical customer then? Are they local? Is it online?
Absolutely. There's local. We really tried to crack that acorn of online sales, and I had some pretty innovative ideas. We started this shop in 2011, so there was already a very prominent online presence for musical instrument businesses, and guys who had been there for decades, really, at that point. So I was a real late comer to the game. I had a concept, however, though, that what nobody was doing at that time is if I'm trying to convince somebody to buy something online from me, such as a musical instrument, that's hard to do because it's a very touchy-feely kind of thing that you want to connect with. So I thought if I took every single instrument that I'm advertising on my website online and I did a little 3-minute video of that exact instrument, and I identified it by its serial number.
Sure.
And so if you're on my site and you click and you want to look at a new Taylor 114 CE model, there I am playing the one that I'm going to ship you. And I thought that was a grand idea. It took a ton of time to record every instrument in the shop and edit them and then get them up on the site and so forth. So it's very time consuming, but I thought it had value. And it turns out in reality, it really didn't. It didn't. I think I was already beyond. I think people already were at the point of trusting what they were going to be buying.
Sure.
And they didn't necessarily need that extra bit of information, which still baffles me because I think that
it sounds like a good idea to me.
Super helpful.
Yeah.
But it really didn't. So internet sales, really never panned out. Now we have sold some pieces over the internet, but it's mainly people who have been in the shop. And you asked who shops in our store, being on the Highway 50 corridor, of course, Crested Butte, Mount Crested Butte, we've got so much traffic coming through Gunnison. And so I've really found there's people who are guitar enthusiasts that will actually travel Highway 50 looking for guitar shops across the country. And then along the way, of course, I developed our own instrument called the Dobrato. And so that's become more of a destination piece of equipment. So people will come from quite a ways away to just
to see that.
Check that out.
Well, before we get into Dobrato and some other things, how would you describe the musical scene here in the Gunnison Valley?
Oh, it's super strong. I think the valley is just so obviously gorgeous. It attracts all kinds of professional people. And there's a lot of quality musicians that are here. And, they're from every style of music, too. So there's so much talent in the valley. It's amazing. And there's so much talent that just passes through town, too.
Nice. Well, let's go ahead and skip on to the Dobrato. So what is it, and what's the...
So the Dobrato, I'll back up a little bit. This is about 11 years ago. I was playing a resophonic style guitar. People think of them as dobros. And it's kind of a bluegrassy toned instrument. It was really developed originally to be a loud instrument that preceded electric instruments. So it's unique in the sense that it has a cone, an aluminum cone, that really produces the sound, as opposed to a standard guitar where when you strum the strings, it's the wood vibrating that's making the sound. Well, back in the late 20s and early 30s, they're preceding electric instruments. There was a call made out that we need louder instruments. Guitars were becoming more popular, and they wanted to be used in big bands, small bands, dance bands, but you couldn't hear them. So the Dopier brothers came up with this concept of a resophonic style guitar that utilized an aluminum cone under the strings, made it louder.
It's like a built-in amplifier.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's more like a speaker enclosure. It is amplified, but the cone is kind of like your speaker cone.
Okay.
In a speaker. That's what I was playing on, and playing kind of finger-style blues. Well, I had an idea that I'd really like to add a vibrato to it, just to add another voice or another color to the palette of what this instrument was producing. And a vibrato, a lot of people think of them as a whammy bar. There was a fellow named Bigsby, and back in the 50s, he came up with this mechanism that you attach to a guitar, and at that time, Hawaiian music was extremely popular in stringed instruments. And he had a buddy who was a professional guitarist that wanted something that he could mimic a Hawaiian steel guitar with. Well, this vibrato arm that Bigsby eventually developed allowed you to mimic some of the effects that you would get out of steel guitar. So they wound up on all kinds of instruments, and I wanted to use that on my resophonic guitar. So I started shopping around, seeing who made resophonic guitars with a vibrato system on it. I found nobody did. And at that time, I was in a resophonic guitar forum, and I put the word out, hey, I'm looking for a resophonic guitar with a vibrato system on it. And somebody told me, if you know of anybody. And it turns out the answers were always no, but if you hear something, let us know. We're interested too. So, therein began my garage project, and so I had a Bigsby vibrato. I had my resophonic guitar. So I spent about a year really figuring out the best way to mount this to a resophonic style guitar. And it was a little tricky, but ultimately figured it out. And brought it into the shop here. We had opened Castle Creek Guitars now at that point. And I had it in the shop, and I'd have other resophonic guitar players come in and want to try it out, and they were very intrigued by it, and ultimately they'd bring in their instrument, and I'd do that modification I had figured out how to do with my instrument. So I had modified a number of resophonic guitars for other people, and one day the light bulb went off as to, there's quite a bit of interest and demand for this product. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So that's when my business partner, Brian Howe, and I decided, let's see what we can do to put together a very unique instrument. And it was. Nothing like that existed, still doesn't at this time. So that was kind of the early days of the Dobrato. It started as we built, over the course of 5 years, 4 different prototypes trying to get this the sound I was shooting for. And let's see, along the way, I was contacted by a fella named James Alday out on the East Coast, upstate New York. And he had seen my instrument, or prototypes of my instrument, and he was working on a mechanism that would mimic a B-bender. Well, a B-bender is another mechanism that you can add to a guitar that mimics a pedal steel guitar. And so nobody had ever combined a vibrato with a B-bender. The B-bender was developed by Clarence White and Gene Parsons back in the 60s. They were both with the Byrds at that time. And what they wanted to do was develop something that could mimic a pedal steel guitar. They came up with the B-bender. The B-bender was a very rudimentary design. It had cables and pulleys and cams, and you'd pull down on the neck of the guitar, and it had performed that B-bender function, which is basically pulling your B string to a C sharp. And in a bit, I'll show you or let you hear what that sounds like. Okay. But it's the quintessential pedal steel bend, if there is such a one. That's it. So these guys developed this mechanism, and that was around for decades, actually. Well, James Alday had developed a mechanism that theoretically could be put into a vibrato arm. So we got together on this, and I designed the housing and the arm and everything. He owns the intellectual property on the actual bending motion, but it is patented. Okay. And so we've combined that into one arm. So with one motion, I can do vibrato, and a secondary motion, I can pull my B to a C sharp, which is the pedal steel move. So now our instrument, not only does it have a very unique voice because of how I wanted to tone out the resophonic guitar, but it also has a vibrato B-bender that's really never existed before. I had the opportunity to develop the pickup. These are acoustic and electric. So the pickup was developed by Paul Beard, and who also spins my aluminum cones out on the East Coast. So everything about the instrument is unique and designed specifically for the instrument.
And this is the only place that they can be purchased, correct?
Right. I started off with some prototypes while I was developing the wood body, which I knew would be my end game. I put together about 80 metal body instruments where I didn't design the body, I didn't design the neck, I bought the bodies and necks. And then I do my thing to them. I use my cone, my mechanism, and so forth. And because I wanted to get the concept out there, but I knew it wasn't really the final product. I knew the wood body had the voice that I wanted to get. So I have about 80 of those floating around out there also.
Gotcha. For someone like me who doesn't really know this, so you can just buy like from a wholesaler different bits and pieces of a guitar?
No, I have them manufactured.
Okay, so they're manufactured.
Right, everything is custom manufactured for the design for the Dobrato, and then I assemble everything, and I manufacture some of it, and some of it I have manufactured. But what's the question?
Well, I guess just how are they built? I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to you asked where if you can only buy them at Castle Creek Guitars. In the early days, I was really fortunate to get one of my prototypes into Corner Music in Nashville, and that was a big boost in getting it into an area where there's real players, there's established guitar shops, and we got it into Corner Music and started selling a number of the instruments through them. In fact, they took a chance on it. I sent them one, and I tracked it. And I knew it had shown up that day, so I called them to find out if it arrived safely. Mm-hmm. And they said, yeah, it arrived great, and we already sold it, so send 2 more. And I'm like, okay, therein it starts. Uh-huh. And so we developed a really nice relationship with Corner Music in Nashville. But I did find over time that as some of these big players were starting to purchase it and perform with it on stage, that people were finding me, and they'd buy them through Corner Music, but for the most part they were really locating me and buying them through the shop. So I found I really didn't need to wholesale them.
All right, well, if you could go ahead and play the Dobrato for us real quick.
So the Dobrato has a mechanism that allows me to mimic a pedal steel guitar as well as add vibrato. So vibrato, if I play a chord straight, it rings smoothly. My vibrato arm, if I manipulate it, which is pushing it down and then letting it come back to 0, you can hear that it lowers the tension on all the strings. So if I waver that, that's how I get that vibrato effect. It's similar to your singing voice. If you want to sing a note straight, you can. You can add a little vibrato to add some feeling to the movement. So that's the vibrato. Now the other motion I have is the pedal steel movement, which is the B bender. And that's pulling the arm, the same arm that I use as the vibrato. If I pull it laterally, that's pulling just the B string up to a C sharp. So if I were playing a pedal steel guitar and I depressed the first 2 pedals on a pedal steel guitar, that's the same tone I would get. So on the Dobrato, you can mimic probably the most used function of a pedal steel guitar. I'll play it. Yeah, I mentioned also, we have been fortunate to get a fairly healthy list of very qualified players, and probably I'll name off a couple. I'd say early on, Mac McAnally, who was Jimmy Buffett's guitarist for forever, was the first guy to really take a keen interest in the Dobrato. And he purchased one, performs with it with Jimmy Buffett. Then Buffett found it really interesting himself. So over time, I built a couple of those for Jimmy also.
That's awesome.
So, these guys aren't necessarily using the mechanism, but they play in front of hundreds of thousands of people. So it's that exposure, the eyeballs.
Yeah.
And that's what enabled me to have people start to find me as opposed to trying to find them in shops.
Yeah.
Then down the road, picked up some other really fine players, Mike Campbell and Tom Petty. Jason Isbell won a Grammy for a song, If We Were Vampires. And he performed, and he always performs and wrote it on the Dobrato. So when Jason Isbell's playing a show, he's pretty much obligated to play that song because it's a Grammy-winning song. A lot of people want to hear it. So at every Isbell show, I do get that exposure where the instrument's really featured on that piece too. Recently, picked up David Hidalgo of Los Lobos, and he's in the studio actually right now recording, and he writes me to tell me how much he loves it and that he's performing on it right now. So, yeah, I've been very fortunate with the A-list players,
Is that, this is a weird question to ask, how do I ask it, but is that almost more fulfilling than playing it yourself to see these Grammy winners and things?
I'll have to say it's a real kick. And no, I think nothing really beats playing on it, and that's why these guys are playing on it.
Right.
It's just fun. It's unique. There's nothing like it in the world. So if you want to get that sound, this is the instrument to do it on. But from hobbyists to pros, I think once they're exposed to it and put it in their hands and see the capabilities, their wheels start turning because, I'm able to mimic some pedal steel moves. I can add some vibrato, but it's not a country guitar. It's great in country, but I have jazz players that are doing some really interesting things with the B-bender. And so, it just opens up a real vast territory of creativity that you didn't have before. So I think that's the real keen draw to the instrument.
It's really fun. Well, let's start to wrap it up a little bit. Gunnison is home for you.
Yes.
Why do you choose to make Gunnison your home?
Well, here I am. Came here in 71. Here I am, 50 years later almost? Just love the valley, frankly. Didn't really plan it that way. I planned on coming here to go to school and then set off to see what life had in store. But circumstances, in a lot of ways, the opportunity to take over a business that I was so really in love with, and to buy it out, and I couldn't think of doing it in a better place than this. The beauty is obvious. The winters are getting more brutal all the time, but summers are well worth it. I fish. It's a great place to raise a family, which we've done. I met my wife here 3 days after we both arrived in 1971.
Nice.
So, we've got a lot of history here.
Awesome. Where can people learn more about about Castle Creek and Dobrato? What's your website?
Yeah, the website is castlecreekguitars.com. And anybody's always welcome to come in. I'm happy to give them a demonstration of the Dobrato and just take a look at our shop. Like I said earlier, it's a very unique shop to have this many fine vintage instruments and new product, used product, every price point, literally, in this kind of population base is kind of unheard of. So it's a very unique shop. We're very pro-education. And I do want to give a shout-out to the fine instructors that teach out of our shop because Lizzie Plotkin, Jenny Hill, who now has her own studio, Evelyn Roper, Recently, Kevin Doherty has started working with us, and he's a super fine guitarist, but he's also going to be working the shop. But we're very pro-education, pro-kids education, and we try to pride ourselves in putting instruments in the hands of kids that have been on my shop bench and set up as best that instrument can play. So these kids aren't battling some entry-level instrument that even on the best day they can't play it. I probably couldn't play it either because they're just not set up right. So we have a great lesson program by super fine instructors that give back to the community a lot. So
that's awesome. And last question, who else should I interview?
Boy, my candidate would be a fellow that got into business right about the exact same time I did, and his name is Chris Haas. And Chris and some partners started the Tune-Up Bike Shop on Main Street in the 70s. And Chris spearheaded anything to do with skiing, biking in the valley here. And
the Tune-Up was an institution for a long time.
Absolutely, and it was all because of Chris Haas.
Okay, that's a great one. Well, thanks so much, and all right. Thanks for listening to the Crested Butte is Home podcast. All the episodes can be found at crestedbutteshome.com, or you can subscribe on your favorite podcast player. You can also find real estate information for both Crested Butte and Gunnison at crestedbutteshome.com. And thanks so much for listening. I will be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode.